Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and today's contract tip is a continuation on the series I have been doing on repair issues when buyers and sellers are negotiating to sell a property to one another. So additionally, please check on this YouTube channel, Real Estate Made Crystal Clear. Please check the playlist repairs. There are a number of other videos on repair issues and different tips and tricks on how to manage those in your contract in that whole playlist on repairs. But today I just want to cover how to handle repair issues, how to handle repairs with the fewest number of issues possible. So in the previous two videos, I have talked about the difference between buyer and a seller going under contract with a due diligence period versus a right to request repairs. Yes, there is a difference. Please go watch that video. I'll link it below. As well as how to actually write an amendment requesting repairs from the seller. Those are the previous two videos I've done on repairs. Again, please check the playlist. But today is what's the best way for a buyer and a seller to handle repairs so that there are the fewest number of issues available. And I just wrote down some notes so that I make sure to convey everything to you. So number one, it would behoove a seller to have pre-inspections done prior to putting the house on the market. Have an inspection done. Repair what needs to be repaired. Replace what needs to be replaced. Keep your invoices. Keep your receipts. Have a termite inspection done. If there's any active termites, remove the termites. If there's any damage from the termites, repair that damage. Another issue would be for the seller to pre-appraise property prior to putting it on the market. There are some appraisal companies out there that if you have it appraised for sale, but before putting it on the market, and then a contract comes in and it comes in less than that appraisal price, they will fight it for you. So check with that. But the reason that I suggest perhaps having it pre-appraised is that a lot of times what happens is a buyer and a seller will negotiate for repairs or negotiate financially. They're fine with that. Then the appraisal comes in low and the seller agrees to sell it for the lower appraised sale price, but then they're not so keen on either the financial negotiations they made in lieu of repairs or performing those repairs. So that would potentially prevent a renegotiation of everything, two issues at once, if the property should appraise lower than sale price. Again, I already mentioned this is actually number 3, for the seller to get a termite clearance letter. That will make the property more amenable, so to speak, to a buyer that is getting a conventional loan, an FHA loan, or a VA loan. So that opens up, creates a broader pool of buyers for any seller. So now, those are some tips. So now what happens if you go under contract, buyer and the seller go under contract, and the buyer does have an independent inspection done by the inspector of the buyer's choice, and there are some concerns with the property that the buyer would like the seller to address. What do you do now? The way to do it to potentially have the fewest number of problems is to handle that issue financially rather than having the repairs done. Now, the reason I say this is, generally speaking, a seller who is selling a home is going to want to have any issues taken care of the least expensive way as possible. A buyer buying a new home they're going to move into wants those repairs done the best way possible. Those are not always one and the same issue regarding vendors being hired to do the work, or whomever is doing the work, or materials used, so forth and so on. And you don't want to avoid any issues, especially at the closing table. So now, unless it is an FHA or VA insured loan that the buyer's getting, where those repairs most likely have to be done before closing. There are some loan issues, so please check with your lender. Then, again, financially is the best way to deal with them. So, what are the ways to, well, before we do that, if repairs have to be done, if the buyer's getting an FHA insured loan or a VA insured loan, those repair issues that would be mandated by the lender are already addressed financially in the GAR, Georgia Association of Realtors, loan exhibits. It is not addressed in a conventional loan contingency exhibit in GAR or specifically in the RE contract forms. So GAR has made a special stipulation that basically is the same verbiage as it is in the FHA and VA loan issues. And it is, for those of you on the GAR purchase and sale contracts, it is special stipulation number 524, lender required repairs. And it states any repairs required by lender are to be completed and paid for by blank, and you negotiate buyer or seller, prior to closing, provided such repairs do not exceed X amount of dollars in total costs. In the event the anticipated costs exceed the amount listed above, an itemized estimate shall be provided to all parties from third-party contractors selected by the seller of the total cost of repairs to be made in the property. Seller or buyer shall have the option to pay the excess amount than what's already negotiated. If the parties do not agree in writing who shall pay the excess amount, then this agreement shall terminate within 3 days of written notice of the itemized estimate. So that's the same verbiage in the FHA and VA loan exhibits. That is a special stipulation if the buyer is getting a conventional loan. And we don't see a lot of lender required repairs on conventional loans generally, but we are seeing them barking at squirrels in the trees. We are seeing them on loans where a buyer's getting their loan from one of the traditional big banks. For example, Wells Fargo. Some of those banks, we are actually seeing lender mandated repairs on conventional loans. So check with the lender and the buyer on that. So, but back to an easier way to deal with it. So how do you negotiate financially? Well, there are a number of ways to negotiate financially, and it kind of depends on what's going on. So you could lower the sale price. You could negotiate between the buyer and the seller to have a lower sale price to come down from the already negotiated sale price based on the amount it would cost to repair or replace any items. That could be a good option, especially if the appraisal is going to be a concern, or just a cleaner, easier way. If you're going to do that, make sure you do that in enough time to get that information, that amendment, to the lender, so the lender prepares the loan with the new sale price. That won't necessarily help a buyer if there are repairs that actually need to be done and the buyer does not have the cash to actually complete those repairs once they move into the home. Another way would be to increase the seller's contribution to the buyer's closing costs. Again, you need to check with the lender regarding if that's possible, and if that does get negotiated that way, you've got to get that amendment to the lender as soon as possible to avoid any delays in the lender processing the loan with new information from when they first received the contract. Again, if the buyer doesn't have the cash or the credit to actually perform those repairs once they move in, might not be ideal. If you are going to handle the repairs financially by changing the sale price or the seller's contribution to the buyer's closing costs, in an amendment where you address that, you want to be cautious of using the verbiage in lieu of repairs. If you put, all parties agree to a new sale price of blank in lieu of repairs, you're going to have potentially lender issues saying repairs. This is the collateral for the loan. What's wrong with my collateral? And they may look at that a little differently. So you would just want to say all parties agree to a new sale price of X amount of dollars. Or sellers per paragraph A blank in the purchase and sale agreement. All parties agree that seller will make a contribution to the buyer's closing costs, a total contribution to the buyer's closing costs of blank. The probably a more ideal way for you to consider to handle this would be to have invoices created, have the estimates for the repairs done in invoices, and you're going to do an amendment that would say at closing, from seller's proceeds, seller to pay blank, and that would be the name of the vendor, X amount of dollars, and that's it. And you're going to want to be able to provide those invoices. So at closing, from seller's proceeds, seller to pay blank vendor X amount of dollars. You're going to, the reason that this is perhaps a better way to handle this is, number one, it does not affect a buyer's loan, because it is not the seller making any kind of a contribution to the buyer. What happens in that situation, you're going to want to make sure, again, to get that amendment to the closing attorney so that it can go on the HUD statement, as well as copies of those invoices. Then what happens at closing, the closing attorney will write a check to the vendor or vendors, it could be more than one, for that dollar amount. Hand that check physically to the buyer. Then, after you close, the buyer then contacts that vendor and has the payment from the closing attorney's account, so you don't have to worry about a seller perhaps stopping payment on that check or something happening. It's from the closing attorney's bank account, and then the buyer is in charge of scheduling. The buyer can add on something additionally, but that payment is from the seller's proceeds, but the check is actually cut from the closing attorney and physically handed to the buyer to then pay that vendor when they schedule the work. Had an issue that just came up yesterday. That was the seller is actually coming to the table with money. There are no proceeds. If that's the case, then you would just alter that just a little bit to say, at closing, seller to pay X vendor X amount of dollars. So then the cash that the seller, if the seller is bringing cash to closing, they would just have to bring that much more. Let me see, I've got one more note. If, again, I've found as a broker that has been the easiest way to handle this issue with the least amount of contention right before closing, when the repairs either have not been done or the repairs have not been done to the buyer's satisfaction. It's just easier where the buyer is totally in charge of what vendor they want to hire, when that work gets scheduled, and they've got invoices and so forth and so on, and warranties if there are any issues. If, however, the buyer and the seller do end up writing an amendment where the seller does agree to perform some repairs or replacements, you want to make sure that you address what happens if the seller does not perform those repairs. I have addressed this in a variety of ways in a number of issues. Please, again, check the repair playlist on this channel where we talk about special stipulations to address this situation. But let's say, for example, that a buyer and a seller did go under contract. They did agree and sign an amendment to address concerns with the property. Then later on, let's say the appraisal came in low, and so the buyer and the seller agreed to a lower sale price. You have to be careful and make sure that everybody understands, is that lower sale price, is that just due to an appraisal issue, or does that also encompass the repairs that the seller had previously agreed to make? So if a buyer and seller negotiate on a lower sale price after they've gone binding, and perhaps after the appraisal has been done, or it could be, there could be a number of situations where this comes up. If my point is, in an amendment to do that, where you're going to change the sale price and or change the closing costs after an amendment to address concerns has already been fully executed and agreed upon, but you're agreeing to handle it financially now, you must negate that previous amendment. So, for example, what you would do is in an amendment, you would say, all parties agree to a new sale price of X amount of dollars, or all parties agree seller's contribution to buyer's closing costs shall now be Y amount of dollars. If this renegotiation financially is to negate the seller's obligation to perform those repairs or replacements, you must add another stipulation or item on this amendment that would say, all parties agree amendment number 1 or amendment to address concerns is no longer part of this contract. If you do not specifically say that, then that previous amendment to address the concerns does remain in full force and intact if the parties don't specify in a later amendment to remove that. Again, you definitely want to make sure another way to handle this on an amendment to address concerns, and I have this verbiage. I will attach a link below, but one special stipulation would be, all parties agree that the repair work contemplated and agreed upon herein shall be completed not less than 5 business days prior to the closing date. And again, you guys, give yourself some time. Don't do it at closing like the GAR contract has written in their pre-printed verbiage, because that doesn't give you enough time to do a work through to negotiate if you have to. All work shall be completed by vendors licensed in the state of Georgia through proper licensing boards to complete the work required herein. Seller shall provide the buyer at least 5 days prior to closing evidence of vendors licensed to repair work, invoices, paid receipts for all work completed. Should the seller not complete the work required herein at least 5 days in advance of closing, buyer shall have the right to either immediately hire vendors of buyer's choice and have the work completed at the seller's expense to be paid at time of closing from seller's proceeds, or terminate the contract with full refund of all earnest money deposits. So if that is the special stipulation that you would add in an amendment to address concerns, again, you must address the consequence of the seller not performing. If that does in fact happen, you need to make sure that the closing attorney is aware of that verbiage, that the closing attorney is aware that the seller did not perform those repairs. Provide the closing attorney as well as the seller and the listing agent with those receipts, so that that dollar amount and that vendor can be put on the final closing statement. And then make sure that both agents and buyers and sellers are reviewing a preliminary settlement statement. And again, generally speaking, if you do negotiate for repairs, put in verbiage to make sure that that is addressed in enough time to be able to handle it rather than in advance, rather than at the closing table. So what about you? Comment below. What are some strategies that you have found in practice that have ameliorated this situation of repair issues between a buyer and a seller? Or if you have run into issues, how did the parties get it resolved? I think that's it. Again, best way to handle it is financially, rather than having the repairs done, as a consideration to have the fewest amount of headaches and upset buyers and sellers on an occasion that is really fun and exciting in selling and purchasing a new home. Hope this contract tip helped you out. Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.